The Super Nintendo released in 1991 here in North America to compete with Sega's 2-year-old Genesis system at the time. And looking back, I think it's fair to say the Super Nintendo was way better than the Genesis. And the NES too. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the NES. I mean, it was what introduced all these groundbreaking franchises to the video game world that are still going strong today. But the SNES pretty much took all those 80s franchises and pretty much made them the best things humanity has ever developed. I mean, Donkey Kong Country, Super Metroid, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Mario World? It's not even a contest. The SNES easily trounces the NES in more ways than one, despite the NES also being an excellent system as well. And while the games we got on the Super Nintendo are from franchises that originated on the NES or the arcades, and are fantastic in their own right, the other big games on the Super Nintendo are also from not pre-established franchises, and franchises that made their debut here, on the Super Nintendo. I mean, Super Mario RPG, F-Zero, Pilot Wings, Stunt Race FX, and you know your console's gonna win the competition if your system has Stunt Race FX on it. Don't worry, I looked it up. But one of the most iconic franchises that got their start on the Super Nintendo, specifically in 1993, was StarFox. I think a lot of StarFox's appeal comes from the Nintendo 64 game StarFox 64 and the GameCube games, Assault and Adventures. And the reason I say this is because with the other entries that I didn't mention, you don't hear a lot of people talk about them as much, and if you do, they're not usually as highly regarded as the other ones. Now, I've only ever played the original on the Super Nintendo and StarFox 64, so I couldn't really say. But for today, I want to focus on the original game, you know, the start of it all, and discuss whether I think it holds up 29 years after its original release. I mean, if F-Zero is still fun to play today, and it came out 2 years before StarFox, then surely that's a good sign, right? What could go wrong? Now, this game was developed in collaboration between Nintendo and Argonaut Games, who apparently also developed the Super Nintendo chip that makes StarFox work. The Super FX chip is a chip that was implemented into StarFox to showcase the 3D capabilities of the Super Nintendo by implementing various polygons to showcase this game's 3D effects. I'll be honest, for an ambitious game that was attempting 3D on a system that does best with mainly 2D graphics, StarFox is actually one of the most technologically impressive games on the system. And this was in 1993, a year before the Sony PlayStation was all about 3D games, and 2 years before Nintendo scared its fans away from the idea of actually doing 3D with the Virtual Boy. It was the 90s, I'll give Nintendo the benefit of the doubt on this one. But I kinda get a feeling that StarFox kinda made developers realize that they could try some new technological stuff with their games on this system. I mean, various Super Nintendo games at the start of the system's lifespan kinda gave off a bit of 3D with games like F-Zero and Super Mario Kart, but after games like StarFox was one of the big titles on the system to do it, and have way more of it, more and more Super Nintendo games were coming out that took advantage of the system's tech. The Donkey Kong Country games, Super Mario RPG, Yoshi's Island. Now, it might have just been a coincidence, and these games probably had the idea of pushing the SNES's graphical capabilities to its limits before StarFox, but it was kinda cool and added to the Super Nintendo library, becoming way more interesting because of it. Oh right, aren't we talking about StarFox? Man, this always happens to me in August. So StarFox is an intergalactic space rail shooter where you're traveling across different planets across the Lilat system as a team of anthropomorphic animals called StarFox, consisting of Falco Lombardi, Peppy Hare, Slippy Toad, and the leader of StarFox, Fox McCloud. Oh, now I see it. An evil scientist named Andross on planet Venom wants to take over the Lilat system, which you of course refuse to have any of. Therefore, you and your team need to get to Venom and stop Andross. It's your typical Nintendo plot that doesn't really play a major role in the game. It's just here as an excuse for you to get out of there and just do your thing. I mean, I find this relatable. Last week I plugged in my Wii U to buy more Virtual Console games because later this month Nintendo will remove the ability to add funds to the 3DS and Wii U eShop. So you know I had to do it just for that particular reason. But I can't talk your ears off about that today. I'm supposed to be doing that for StarFox right now. So? Very happy I found a use for this thing. StarFox features a ton of planets/levels that actually do something pretty interesting. After you beat the game's first level, Corneria, you then have the option to choose your preferred route to the final boss, with each of the 3 routes offering a different difficulty option throughout, encouraging multiple playthroughs and replayability. And I do quite like how with the different difficulty options, it's not just the same levels except slightly altered to be harder. These are completely unique levels designed with challenge in mind. Now, it's not like StarFox 64 where a different route is unlocked after completing a specific objective, but hey, for a game from 1993, it's pretty cool and really does show just how ambitious this game can truly be. Not as much when you have gameplay like this. So as I mentioned before, StarFox is a rail shooter where you're piloting a ship through a bunch of differently themed planets while blasting any and all enemies on screen. Some require one hit, others require multiple. It's never really all that hard to take down enemies for the most part, but your allies will sometimes ask you for help when they can't shake them. And that's another thing, your allies. Every so often, your allies will interact with you, whether it's to ask you for help or just random nonsense that they have no business saying to you. Go screw yourself, Falco. And they usually use these robotic sound effects as their voices, which do the job, I guess. I mean, we are on weak hardware here, so voice acting probably wouldn't be possible on such limited hardware. Until the very end of the game, where voice acting is exactly what they do, which is pretty weird how it's at the end of the game but not throughout the entire game. But hearing how compressed and butchered the audio actually sounds, I think I know why it was only used once in the game. But the second game, StarFox 64, would go all out for voice acting, and it's a major improvement over this. All the characters sound exactly how they should, and really brings out their character that much more. It's still compressed quite a bit, but not nearly as bad as the original. Now let's continue that negativity by going back to the gameplay. What, you thought after I complained about the voice acting that's where I draw the line? Not really, no. And I know it's not really fair to judge this game from a modern perspective since this game probably got butchered by the Super Nintendo's hardware limitations, but man, this game feels like a very rough prototype of StarFox 64. I mean, the game's rough in general, but the visuals and gameplay are probably the most obvious when it comes to talking about what parts of the game has aged over the past 29 years. So what, am I really going to complain about something about a game that due to hardware limitations are flaws that are probably out of the developer's control? Hell yeah, of course I am. The polygons that make up this game's graphics just make up a jumble of abstract geometry that doesn't really look like anything or a place. It just looks like a jumble of shapes turned into a StarFox level that isn't really all that appealing to the eyes. I mean, when you look at the levels in StarFox 64, yeah, it's still just a jumble of polygons, but it's put together in a way where I could still tell what's what. I barely feel that way with the original. Alright, that's enough comparisons with StarFox 64. I could almost tell what nothing is, though. I mean, I could make out a few things like, oh, that's the R-Wing, that's a ship, that's a giant floating scientist head. Poor guy really needs a hospital. But for the most part, however, it's just not immediately obvious what's what when everything is put together out of a bunch of abstract geometry, and it kind of makes the levels in this game feel pretty forgettable because of it. I mean, I think the levels are designed okay. I mean, even if the aesthetic of them isn't really anything to write home about, the level design is pretty okay. There might be a lot of enemies on screen, or there might be some stuff in the way that you need to turn in order to not fly into, but I think the level design is perfectly fine regardless. There's even a mini boss fight at the end of each level. There's a few weak spots on it that you have to keep shooting in order for its health meter to decrease and slowly dismantle the ship enough for it to succeed. They're pretty forgettable, to be honest. Not bad or anything. I mean, they were all fairly decent at the very least, but nothing that really stuck with me. Something that also never really stuck with me a whole lot were the controls. I know there are a lot of it's fines in this video, and that applies to the controls as well, but I do have a bit of a gripe with the controls being the control layouts. I could tell the developers wanted to give players as many options with the controls as possible because there's 4 different control types here labeled by the first 4 letters of the alphabet. I can definitely commend the developers for doing something like this for a game like this, but somehow, none of the control layouts felt right to me. Specific attacks will always be tied to specific button presses that are out of your reach, like how one button will be tied with Y and another will be tied with A. Like, why does it feel like just a very awkward jump for your thumb to make? If anything, it would make more sense to have the more crucial actions tied with Y and B or X and A, but no, it just feels awkward as all hell. I mean, it's not the worst thing ever, and I did eventually adjust to it throughout my playthrough, but just no matter what, it will never feel fully natural to me. Now the music, on the other hand, I could definitely get behind. I think there's some cool tracks in here, and it fits the whole space shooter gameplay of StarFox quite well. It's not as iconic as the soundtracks for, say, Super Mario World or A Link to the Past, but it fits the bill okay. And then there's the frame rate. It's garbage. I know when I usually talk about games, I don't really bring up the frame rate at all unless it's a major situation where it affects the actual gameplay and not something that stands out as a minor blemish like in most games. And you bet your R-wing that the frame rate affects the gameplay of StarFox. This is one of the bigger flaws with the StarFox, is the frame rate plays a crucial role in the game's flaws. What frame rate does this game even run at anyways? 20 FPS? It is so slow, and honestly makes this game harder to play because of it. It makes it harder to land hits on enemies. It makes dodging obstacles disguised as geometry harder. I mean, hell, it even makes dodging attacks from enemies harder. It really does affect the overall gameplay and plays a big factor as to why this game doesn't age well to begin with. I know I'm probably exaggerating a little bit, but I really do mean it when I say the frame rate really did affect my enjoyment with the game. This game is just made much harder to play because of it, and honestly, it really is the worst thing ever. I should monetize this movie. So, we've suffered through the game's visuals, control layout, and frame rate. Now it's time to go to Venom and tackle the bad boy himself, Andross. The final boss is okay. You have to traverse this tunnel with Andross attempting to sound menacing. Then once you made it through that, you're appears and you have to fight him. His means of attacks are by shooting out these rectangular boulder things from his mouth that you have to dodge. And he'll also take a page out of Kirby's books and try to inhale you as well. Your only means of taking damage on him is by shooting both of his eyes with your lasers enough times until he turns into this weird box thing. It's a StarFox game. I'm not going to question its logic. And for this phase, you just mindlessly shoot it as it's floating around enough times for it to be destroyed. But if you're not fast enough, Andross will return back to himself and you have to repeat the cycle. And honestly, this boss fight really isn't that bad. But what makes it annoying is how the game's technical limitations, just like in the rest of the game, makes dodging all those attacks much harder when the frame rate is slideshow worthy. So what's next? After you take out the box, Andross is defeated and the galaxy is saved. Hooray! And then the last thing you see before the credits is a cutscene of the crew on their way back to Corneria, while also showing you your score for each of the levels you played through.
This is Corneria, Pepper speaking. Congratulations on a job well done.
There it is. There's the voice acting. Well, what did I tell you guys? And that's StarFox on the Super Nintendo. Overall, I can commend Nintendo for wanting to do something ambitious like this on a system from the 90s. But unfortunately, that ambition really didn't do them many favors when the game could barely play on a system without downgrading the hell out of it. The graphics are just made out of basic geometry, the frame rate would take a major hit, so much so that the game is rendered pretty much unplayable by today's standards, and the control layout just isn't for me at all. Don't get me wrong, it's still impressive that something as ambitious as this is still running on the system, but if various hardware limitations make the game play like this, then at that point, why even do it? So with all the negativity that has been circulating in this video, you might assume that I somehow think the game is bad. Not really, no. What the hell, after all that nitpicking and whining, I don't think the game is bad? Here's the thing, while I think StarFox is an ambitious project that doesn't really hold up today, I still think you could get a little bit of fun out of it despite its aging elements that makes that a bit hard to do so. I want to give this game a fair amount of appreciation for what it is. Yes, it is quite a bit unplayable by today's standards, but I actually ended up having a little bit of fun with the game. Nowhere near as much as other entries like 64, but you know, enough for me to actually be a bit less harsh on the game. The gameplay, while it doesn't really hold up and is kind of butchered by the game's frame rate, still can be kind of cool and give people a decent amount of fun. The music is top notch. Such a surprise. Leave it to Nintendo to make a game that doesn't hold up 29 years after its release but still has a soundtrack that's just incredible. And the level design. Yes, while it is just a jumble of shapes, still is fairly well designed. So yeah, despite the game's flaws that has more to do with its age, there are a few redeeming elements about it, and my copious amount of nitpicking isn't going to hide that fact either. Man, somebody is not going to like this video. I think at that time Nintendo was trying to show everybody that their system was the superior option over systems like the Sega Genesis, which can barely do 3D. So I think maybe Nintendo's mentality at that time was if they put out games that push the SNES's hardware to its limits, it could take out the competition. Now I'm not 100% sure if that was the case, but I'm just explaining what I think this game was put into production for. Or maybe it was for an early April Fool's joke. I mean, I could see the logic behind that. I do love jokes, and StarFox on Super Nintendo is one of the funniest ones I know. It might have been cool in 1993, but now looking back, it's definitely not something to write home about. This game feels like a very early prototype slash demake of StarFox 64, seeing how a game like this would run on more powerful hardware, kinda like how Breath of the Wild when its prototype was an NES game, except the difference is this prototype actually became a retail product that people could buy, while that prototype wasn't. Man, I'm sad. And considering we live in a world now where StarFox 64 exists, the original on Super Nintendo, while it is cool to look back on, isn't a very necessary game to play today. Now that's not to say that after StarFox released, Nintendo forgot about it until StarFox 64. No. The game was originally going to get a sequel 3 years later in 1996 called StarFox 2. But because the Nintendo 64 was on the horizon, a system that could actually do 3D, it never released. Until 20 years later, where Nintendo actually released it as one of the 21 games as part of the SNES Classic Edition mini console in September 2017. Our generation is weird. So yeah, to sum up everything, while I think Star Fox is nowadays, it's not necessarily something I'd see myself going back to as easily. I just don't think it holds up today, and really, there's not much of a reason to even go back to it. And because of which, I think it's fair to say that I don't want Nintendo to ever acknowledge this game's existence ever again. Even if they keep re-releasing this game on stuff like the SNES Classic Edition and Switch Online, which is how I mainly played the game for today's video. Nobody was supposed to know that. I blew my cover. Son of a... And that's going to wrap up today's video. If you enjoyed the video, then please consider subscribing and checking out my other videos on my channel where you'll find more videos like this one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.